We're in Trafalgar Square. And what do you sense in Trafalgar Square? You sense grandeur. This vast space, the National Gallery in front of me, Westminster and the seat of Parliament behind me, Big Ben in the distance. And this giant monument, this monument to Admiral Horatio Nelson. Trafalgar Square to celebrate the victory of the Battle of Trafalgar, Admiral Nelson's victory. This was a naval victory in 1805 that established Britain's decisive control of the seas throughout the 19th century and made possible the empire on which the sun never sets. And you feel that empire everywhere here. This is a site of power and glory. Trafalgar was a battle of supremacy, what we call a hegemonic contest between the two potential dominant powers of Europe. On the one side, Britain with its naval power, and on the other, France with its land-based power. And the competition between these two empires had gone on for centuries and reached a decisive moment in the Battle of Trafalgar. In fact, we can look back to the 1700s for some of the key battles that formed the stepping stone to what became Britain's hegemony over the world's oceans in the 19th century. In the middle of the 1700s, that is in the middle of the 18th century, there was the 7 Years' War, which was a war between France and Britain all over the world, a truly world war, because it was fought in the Americas, it was fought in Europe, it was fought in India, and it was one of the key battles on the way to Britain's 19th century hegemony. The 7 Years' War ended with a British victory over France in North America. Britain gained dominion over Canada. France lost its claims to Canada, and much of the succeeding events over the next decades followed, because after the 7 Years' War came Britain's increasing demands on its North American colonies, including taxation to help repay the debts from the 7 Years' War. And those increasingly onerous taxes really created a storm in the English colonies, and eventually in 1776 led to the Declaration of Independence of the British colonies. Now, that wasn't the end of the story. Of course, war broke out, the War of American Independence, as it's called from the United States side, and it was the British Empire against really small and much weaker colonies. But the weaker colonies prevailed for an important reason. France, the great enemy, contestant of Britain, came to the rescue of the British colonies and sent in its military forces and military advisors and helped the British colonies to vanquish the home empire. And so, of course, the United States gained its independence, or the American colonies gained their independence, and that became the United States of America with the formation of the U.S. Constitution. But the story of the French-British competition continues, because France had spent a lot of money to help the colonies in the Americas, and so now France had a massive debt. The wheel keeps turning. Because of that debt, the French government needed to raise taxes. that led to another uproar, one tax rebellion after another. And that tax rebellion is known to us in effect as the French Revolution, because in 1789, under the burdens of higher taxation, demands by the state, and pressures from below, the forces of French society gathered and overthrew the French monarchy in 1789. And of course, Louis XVI and Marie Antoinette ended up losing their heads in the French Revolution. Now, that brings us to the 1790s, because after the French Revolution, the monarchies of Europe gathered together to fight this new revolutionary republic. And there ensued the wars of the French Revolution of the 1790s. And a initially rather lowly officer quickly rose in the ranks, and by 1799 had effectively launched a coup and declared himself the first consul. That, of course, is Napoleon Bonaparte. And that brings us to Trafalgar Square, because the Napoleonic Wars ensued in the first years of the 1800s. There was a short peace after Napoleon rose to be first consul with the Treaty of Amiens, but Britain decided that it could not allow such French power to go unchecked on the continent. And so in 1803, Britain declared war on Napoleonic France. Napoleon gathered his naval forces and those of Spain, gathered them in Cadiz, in southern Spain, with the idea of invading the British Isles. And those forces gathered in the fall of 1805, and that is where Admiral Nelson comes in, because Admiral Nelson was the brilliant admiral that in remarkably deft maneuvers and basically with a smaller naval fleet than the opposition, triumphed in a magnificent military naval maneuver that has gone down in history as one of the great naval battles of all time. In the end, Nelson himself was wounded and died a day after his remarkable victory. Well, that victory did not end the Napoleonic Wars. They continued throughout the first decade of the 1800s. Napoleon gave up any hope of invading Britain. Britain now controlled the seas, but Napoleon introduced the so-called continental system to embargo British goods, to try to starve the British Isles. If he couldn't invade them, if he couldn't control the seas, he would block them from trade. And that continental system was enforced in much of the continent, but one country was not so interested because it was actively engaged in trade with Britain, and that was Tsarist Russia. And so Napoleon took the fateful decision to invade Russia. Generally a very bad idea, history has shown. And of course, Napoleon invaded, and as is sometimes said, he was ultimately defeated by General Winter. The Napoleonic forces advanced to Moscow. The Russians retreated, and as the Napoleonic troops occupied Moscow in 1812, the Russians burned down their own capital, leaving the French army without cover in the dead of Russian winter. And the rest, of course, is history. Napoleon ended up retreating in desperation from Russia, with a tiny fraction of the troops that he had led in to Russia. Several further battles ensued, remarkable ups and downs, but Napoleon was finally defeated in 1815. But for us here in the grandeur of Trafalgar Square, what all of that meant was that Britain was now the hegemon, the hegemonic power of Europe in effect, but really to become the hegemonic power of the world. The greatest, most far-flung empire in the world. Not in contiguous land area. That claim, that prize goes to Genghis Khan, to the Mongolian Empire. But in the reach around the world, in possessions in the Americas, throughout Africa by the end of the 19th century, throughout Asia, and of course the jewel of the British Empire, so-called India, which became part of the British Empire fully and known as the British Raj in 1858. So we are standing at the heart of the empire of what became the world's greatest empire. Britain bequeathed enormous fundamental change to the whole world in the 19th and 20th centuries. British technology brought industrialization. Industrialization, of course, brought British troops and imperial power all over the world. Britain brought the English language to be the lingua franca of world diplomacy in the 19th and 20th centuries. British finance expanded throughout the world, financing the railroads, a worldwide telegraph system, other remarkable interconnections that made what I've called the sixth age of globalization, the globalization of the industrial world. This was Britain's creation. It fundamentally transformed the world. Britain effectively ruled the world for the 19th century. The British Empire struggled, of course, through the two world wars of the first half of the 20th century and the Great Depression between the two world wars. By the end of the Second World War, Britain was victorious in the war against fascism, but was exhausted as empire. And on August 15, 1947, the crown jewel of the British Empire declared its independence. India and Pakistan became independent nations. The British Empire quickly diminished as countries throughout the empire became independent in the 1940s, 1950s, and 1960s. But the legacy of this vast empire, the empire of the industrial age, continues until today.